Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm with Romy. I run the Jerusalem Press Club. We're very happy to host this morning Dr. Isabella Ginor and Gideon Remez. They are associate fellows at the Truman Institute at the Hebrew University, researching for many years the Soviet-Russian military and intelligence involvement in the Middle East, particularly the Arab-Israeli conflict. They are award-winning journalists. Isabella is a Soviet affairs specialist for Arabs, and Gideon is the head of the foreign news department at Kol Israel. The previous book, I believe you have it over there, is Fox Bets over Dimona, the Soviet nuclear gamble in the Six-Day War, which was published in 2007. This is the sequel. As always, their research and books are thought-provoking and usually challenge the preconceived notions about the depth of the Soviet involvement in the region. So without further ado, just I'll ask you to switch off your cell phones or turn them into silent mode. And Isabella and Gideon, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. First of all, we are very thankful to Jerusalem Press Club for organizing this meeting with our colleagues. And it's really a special honor and pleasure to present our research to our former colleagues from our long and exciting times as journalists. It was back then, in the heady days before and after the demise of the Soviet Union, that we began to collect the material that became a main source for our present project. Much of it was ephemeral, and just because we assembled it in the real time, we now have what is probably a unique database. More about that shortly, but there is a lesson for news people: save your notes and clippings. This was one of the dowries that we brought with us when, after retirement, we shifted our focus to academic research. Another was the journalist's instinct to check out every lead, even those that most academics would reject as prima facie irreconcilable with universal accepted theory. A third journalistic instinct was a readiness to constantly update and refine our story from one deadline to the next. But to use a term that is familiar to us as long-time consumers of what in our day was called the wire services, little did we know that just a few days before this event here, we would have once again to add a new take and even replace the lead for today's talk. The past, it seems, is not just news, but breaking news. And as luck would have it, our particular subject is of abiding front-page news value, not only to Israelis of our generation, for whom these events were a life-shaping experience. The latest example was last week when the IDF archive declassified almost 400 pages of transcripts from meetings of the General Staff just before and just after the June 1967 war. We are still plowing through this trove, but even the quick reports in the Israeli media were immensely gratifying for us. They strongly confirmed our findings, which, when presented in our previous book 10 years ago, were met with skepticism or war. We posited then that the Six-Day War was not, quote, the war that nobody wanted, unquote, but the result of a deliberate joint Soviet-Egyptian plan. Furthermore, a central motive, as well as the reason for the timing, was to prevent Israel from achieving nuclear weapons. This provided the title of our previous book, Fox Bets over Dimona. We identified the two mysterious, intentionally provocative overflights of Israel's nuclear facility at Dimona as made by Soviet-piloted Mi-25 aircraft, NATO's reporting name, Foxbat. The General Staff convened on 19 May 1967, less than 2 days after the first of those flights. The newly released transcript confirms that it was acutely aware of the nuclear context. Intelligence Chief Aaron Yariv listed first among, quote, Egypt's strategic goals to implement the preemptive war for the destruction of Dimona and the Israeli threat to attain nuclear weapons, unquote. Yariv went on to attribute the Egyptians' intent to Soviet information and estimated that there was a direct Soviet interest in fomenting tensions, pointing to a reinforced and threatening presence of the Soviet Navy in the Mediterranean in support of Egypt and Syria. There was then at least some Israeli awareness of precisely what we were ridiculed for when we discovered it from post-Soviet sources, preparations for a naval landing on the Israeli coast. Now, that is news. Remarkably, it came hard on the heels of yet another news item that already had us rewriting this presentation. It had long been reported by foreign sources and transparently hinted by Israeli figures up to the father of the nuclear project, Shimon Peres, that at the blackest stage of the 1967 crisis, Israel indeed undertook a crash effort and completed a nuclear device. Peres and others suggested to detonate it as a deterrent signal. What the new publication early this month added was that this display was intended to be made in Sinai. Now, one of our previous discoveries was that instead of providing Egypt countervailing nuclear weapons, Moscow had pledged a nuclear guarantee. Soviet submarines were posted in the Med with orders to fire nuclear-tipped missiles at Israel if it tried to use weapons of mass destruction. The new element, locating the putative nuclear blast on Egyptian soil, reinforced our conclusion that if this idea had been carried out, it would have been deemed such an attack on Egypt. It therefore would have triggered this Soviet nuclear response, with results too horrible to imagine. We wouldn't be sitting here. We have this from multiple testimonies of commanders and crewmen on these submarines. They were part of a rare find for historians, a body of completely unfamiliar evidence that withstands rigorous evaluations and demands a radical reassessment of concepts that had become all but axiomatic. We were the first to introduce into Western scholarship this entire new genre of primary sources, the memoirs and other publications of the Soviet veterans who took part in the event. How this literature appeared and how it reflected changes in post-Soviet Russia too forms an entire introductory chapter in the book. Suffice it to mention now that around the USSR's demise, economic hardship made the extra benefits of combat veterans vitally significant. But as the Soviet intervention against Israel was never officially admitted, its participants were never recognized as internationalist soldiers. They organized to demand their rights and proper honors for their fallen comrades. The immediate post-Soviet zeitgeist enabled publishing their accounts as a means for this struggle, which they won. Their eyewitness testimonies helped to set the record straight after, to use an unacademic but fashionable term, fake news had evolved over decades into fake history. The first example that I just gave pertain mainly to the Six-Day War and our previous book, but we will go on to show how similar processes apply to the subsequent period. The title of our new book, The Soviet-Israeli War 67-73, causes a lot of raised eyebrows. What a full-scale war in the Soviet Union, and for 6 years. Well, if 50,000 Soviet servicemen directly combated the IDF on the Egyptian front alone, It was nothing less than a war. This was the first and the only time that Israel clashed head-on with a global power, and at the time it was perceived so, even if political constraints dictated downplaying it. The foreword of our book starts with an excerpt from the recently declassified testimony of the Deputy Chief of Staff, Israel Tal, before the Agranat Commission that investigated Israel's initial setback in the Yom Kippur War. To quote, "We knew that actually we were fighting against Russia," unquote. In an exceptional study 25 years ago, former Mossad operative and diplomat Dave Kimche called the entire period that we revisited Brezhnev's War. The first chapter of our new book may be the most useful for you in the coming weeks. Most treatments of the Six-Day War sign off at its ostensible end on 10 June. We stress that a seamless transition began here and peaked in Operation Kafkaz, the Soviet codename that we were the first to introduce to the English reader. At the climax of Soviet intervention in 1969-1970, those regular Soviet servicemen, armed with the USSR's latest and sometimes still experimental weapons, carried out the greatest such operation outside the water path up to Afghanistan. This turned the Suez Canal into the hottest front of the Cold War. But at varying degrees of intensity, it was one consecutive campaign from the Six-Day War through the War of Attrition to the Yom Kippur War. The preliminary stage in the summer of 1967 already determined the pattern that created the precedent in a series of events was upcoming 50th anniversaries provide ample pegs to hand historical news stories on. It was already at this phase that we begin to refute two widespread assumptions. One holds that Israel squandered several opportunities to prevent another war by ignoring or rejecting Egyptian peace fillers. The other notion is that the Soviet leadership, sobered by the Cuban Missile Crisis, had by this time adopted a cautious and responsible policy that would lead to global détente. It therefore, so goes the prevalent view, endeavored to restrain its Arab allies from launching a revanchist war on Israel, which might plunge the USSR into a cataclysmic conflict with the United States. In respect of peace opportunities, the criticism of Israel refers mainly to the year or two before the Yom Kippur War. But it bears to mention now that on 19 June 1967, the Israeli cabinet resolved to propose a peace treaty with Egypt that would include the full return of Sinai. However, the day before, a Soviet cruise liner had repatriated the staff of the Soviet embassy, which had been closed since Moscow broke off relations on 10 June. The ship's captain told the reporter in Haifa he was surprised to find the port and city intact. He had been told that they were bombed out, which reflected the original Soviet plan to intervene once Israel was provoked into an aggressive first strike. So there was no Soviet envoy to receive the cabinet's proposal. It was never publicized, and there is no evidence it was communicated to the Soviets through intermediaries. The Israeli leadership cannot be absolved of responsibility for that. But in any case, it was too late. The Soviets, as well as the Egyptians, each leadership for its own reasons, were already committed to a military achievement before any political settlement. As the Israeli cabinet deliberated on 19 June, the Politburo in Moscow resumed the session that it had continued almost non-stop since the outbreak of war. The ambiance, as one of the president describes, was grim. But General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev had already made up his mind to quote, "One battle is lost, but the struggle against the US and Israel will continue. We will have to start everything from scratch, policy, tactics, diplomacy, arms. This is not going to be inexpensive," unquote. In 1967, the Soviet leadership, political and military, was composed of the generation whose defining experience was the Great Patriotic War. Soviet appellation of the Second World War. The reminiscences provide numerous examples that comparison of Israeli to Nazi aggression was not merely a feature of Soviet propaganda. Deputy Foreign Minister Vladimir Simonov wrote during the Marathon Politburo meeting, quote, "The SOS signals from Cairo were both tragic and comic. The first days of war in the Soviet Union in 1941 were being repeated," unquote. General Alexander Bebornov, a flying ace and hero of the Soviet Union from the Great Patriotic War, was sent to Egypt during the crisis of May 1967 to prepare a Soviet air intervention. As he repeatedly attested, he flew a dozen reconnaissance sorties, including those two over Israel in the still experimental aircraft that later would be called MiG-25. On 5 June, Bebornov witnessed the Israeli air raid on Cairo West Air Base, and his thoughts too went 26 years back. Utter chaos, like the Russian defense of Moscow in 41. According to Soviet military doctrine, only the fall of a nation's capital seals its defeat. The Israelis then were expected to press on across the canal to Cairo, which the Egyptian army was powerless to defend. A Soviet intelligence operative in Egypt, as a reporter for Novosti news agency, aptly described his compatriots' almost instinctive response to quote, "The Russians deployed as though the enemy were within 120 kilometers, not of Cairo, but of Moscow," unquote. There was also an urgent political motive among Soviet allies, especially outside the Warsaw Pact, such as Cuba. Doubts were rising about the USSR's commitment and ability to defend them. So when Brezhnev spoke on 19 June, a sea and airlift to replenish the Arabs' losses in weaponry was already in full swing. Some of the material had been placed before the war and only its delivery was speeded up. But the magnitude of the Egypt debacle demanded marshalling much greater quantities in an unprecedented logistical effort. Stockpiles were emptied throughout the Soviet Union and in East European satellites, but systems had to be pulled even from the Soviets' own defense ally, particularly in air defense. This drew protests from local party leaders and military commanders alike, who felt the homeland's own protection was being jeopardized. But on 20 June, in a closed session of the Central Committee, Brezhnev quoted all dissent, and there was no further challenge to his policy. The protest, however, was not only against the diversion of hardware. Egypt encountered a problem that would affect Israel much more worse in the War of Attrition. Planes and tanks would be replaced, but not the trained manpower to operate them. It was just the veterans' memoirs that revealed what was a secret at the time. The USSR dispatch of so-called advisory teams, in fact regular Soviet detachments, especially anti-aircraft crews. They formed, in effect, the vanguard of an entire division which would be sent in 1969 and would turn the tide in the War of Attrition against Israel. The pattern was thus already set, to deny the presence of regular Soviet formations and call them only advisors, experts, or technicians. This would have great success in forming erroneous and ultimately disastrous concepts in Israel and the United States. Directly from the Central Committee meeting, the USSR's nominal head of state, Nikolai Podgorny, flew to Cairo. The Egyptian narrative about the preparation for the Yom Kippur War was formulated and published only afterwards, when it was no longer politically correct to admit early dependence on the Soviet Union. This narrative holds that Podgorny talks were an utter failure, that he demanded total subordination of Egypt to Soviet demands and was refused. But the Soviet participants' report claimed the opposite. Nasser not only promised the Soviets unrestricted use of all Egyptian air and naval bases, he even stunned his interlocutors with an offer. If Moscow undertook Egypt's defense, he would abandon the non-allied movement of which he was the founder and join the Warsaw Pact. The Soviets balked at such an overt commitment, but as Gideon will describe, subsequent events show they were made good on the rest.
Okay. All change.
Switch roles.
The case, the chair,
Let move out and
I
out.
don't know.
And then I will, let's see. Now, where's mine?
Yep. No.
Well, so as Isabella began to say, the Soviets balked at an overt accession of Egypt to the Warsaw Pact, but in another sign of things to come, Podgorny's political talk served mainly as a smokescreen for military activity. As histories took shape, this resulted in an overemphasis on declared intent, especially ostensible peace plans, as genuine policy rather than mere camouflage. The conventional account has, for instance, the Soviet head of state bringing with him a bevy of ranking officers from all the Soviet armed services. As we now know, this military group came to Egypt well before Podgorny arrived. They stayed after his departure, and they accomplished a lot more. It was led by the Chief of Staff, Matvei Zakharov. The Marshal was nearly 70 years old and a diabetic like Nasser, with whom he commiserated and exchanged medical tips. But he impressed the Egyptians mightily with tireless activity. At the canal front, he berated the Egyptian brass for their men's poor discipline and low state of alert. Taking a spade from one of the soldiers, he demonstrated digging a personal foxhole in 40-degree heat. His staff drew up a plan for a classic Soviet three-tiered fortification line along the canal's west bank and saw that it was completed within a few months. But how little was known so far about all their doings is exemplified by Zakharov's top lieutenant. Thanks to Google, we can now state with full certainty that his name is totally absent, not only from Western historiography, but even from all intelligence reports that have so far been declassified. This is Lieutenant General Pyotr Lashchenko, who was slated to remain in Egypt as chief military advisor, but with the added and very meaningful title, Commander of the Soviet Forces Group. Lashchenko had commanded the suppression of the Hungarian revolt in 1956, but most importantly, he had been named the hero of the Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War for leading his outfit under fire across 4 rivers. His long-term mission in Egypt was to prepare exactly such a combat crossing of a waterway, the Suez Canal. Lashchenko's Soviet subordinates reverently dubbed him our Montgomery, another throwback to World War II, equating his deeds in Egypt with Monty's at El Alamein. Even the Egyptians, who never managed to pronounce or spell Lashchenko's name, conceded the key role that he played. For the time being, this role was mainly to design a training program. The Israeli commanders were mostly Palmach veterans. Is that term familiar to everyone? They soon recognized the method that they remembered from their iconic book about the mythical general Ivan Panfilov in the defense of Moscow. Panfilov reputedly sent raw recruits to seek intentional firefights, regardless of casualties, in order to exercise their fear of their supposedly invincible enemy. Lashchenko applied this to the canal front by sending Egyptian raiding parties across in increasingly large formations, until by the ultimate crossing in October 1973, there was in every boat at least one soldier who had done it before. Barely a month after his arrival in Egypt, the first such raid marked the first of 3 turning points on land, sea, and air that the Egyptian narrative lists from the June fiasco to what they term the October triumph. As already mentioned, no credit is given to the Soviets, but the newly emerged evidence shows that they were indispensably involved in all 3. Besides setting the pattern for direct Soviet intervention against Israel, they advanced its underlying grand design. This dated back to Tsarist times, installing Russian or Soviet presence in the warm water of the Eastern Mediterranean. The first turning point was the Battle of Ras El Ish, about 12 kilometers south of the canal's northern end. We can't begin now to sort out the conflicting claims as to who shot first, but in any case, the result was that an Egyptian force not only crossed the canal eastward, it floated armored vehicles across, which even in 1973, the Egyptians needed Soviet expertise to accomplish. The Israelis suffered serious casualties, Egyptian morale rose, and the Soviets had the legitimacy that they always desired, aiding the victims of real or alleged aggression. Brezhnev told a meeting of Warsaw Pact leaders 2 days later that the Politburo reconvened at 3 a.m. to comply with an urgent plea from Nasser. A communique was issued extraordinarily on a Sunday morning, mark the date, 9th July. Its 50th anniversary next month is worth a history as news story. The announcement was fulfilled the very same day, when with much fanfare, 9 ships of the Soviet Navy's Mediterranean Escadra anchored for a port call at Alexandria and Port Said. The flotilla's commander convened an even more unusual press conference with the governor of Alexandria to declare, "Our cruisers are armed with missiles and are ready to repel any aggression." In frontline Port Said, there remained no Western presence, so no one pointed out that the Soviet warships had already been there for some time, as several of their crewmen attest. A gunnery officer, whose mission to lead a landing force into Haifa port was aborted at the last minute during the June War, was now posted to Port Fouad, opposite Port Said and the remaining Egyptian foothold east of the canal. As he told us, "Every morning at dawn, I would train the guns on the Israeli positions. They were 2 to 3 kilometers away, and I could see them." A Soviet Marine unit had landed at Port Said during the war and attempted to cross the canal eastward as the Egyptian army fled westward. It was decimated by an Israeli airstrike, though of course the pilots couldn't tell whether they were Egyptians or Soviets that they were attacking. And its commander related many years that he too was injured, but he demanded mainly justice for his own men. However, the Marines were reinforced urgently from the Baltic Fleet, and they came ashore again to hold the line. A month after the Soviet ship's port call began, it was extended indefinitely, and both Egyptian harbors became Soviet naval bases in all but name, soon to be followed by several air bases. If you are already sensing an analogy with the present-day Russian acquisition of Latakia and Tartus ports in Syria and airfields there, well, we do too. And it's not the only case of déjà vu that we've been feeling since the latest Russian intervention started. But the Syrian war has diverted attention from the Russian military's quiet return to Egypt too. Late last year, they reactivated an old Soviet base at Sidi Barrani, close to the Libyan border, and held joint maneuvers with the Egyptian army nearby at, you guessed it, El Alamein. Besides training, Lashenko pressed on with his long-range blueprint, including weapons supply for the ultimate offensive to regain Sinai. Most of his recommendations proved to be impressively prescient, such as providing Egypt with the Soviets' latest, sometimes yet experimental, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft and anti-tank systems, which indeed wreaked havoc on Israeli forces in the first days of the Yom Kippur War. Some of his other ideas did not turn out so well. Identifying the Egyptians' weakness in command and control, he suggested dividing the canal front between 2 army corps instead of 1. The cusp between them would become the corridor for Israel's countercrossing that turned the tide of the Yom Kippur War. But first of all, Lashenko had to negotiate an upgrade of the Soviet presence in Egyptian formations. The Soviet officers were no longer to be called experts, Kubara, who were limited to headquarters. Rather, they would be now called advisors, mustasharun, posted in field units down to the brigade level and later even down to the battalion level, with direct access to the troops, quasi-command authority, and instructions to accompany their advisees into combat. Despite Nasser's promise, this change encountered resistance among the Egyptian officer corps, especially those whom the Soviets blamed for losing the war. The breakthrough came only in mid-September after a failed coup or counter-coup led to the suicide or assassination of the Egyptian commander-in-chief, Abdel Hakim Amel, who had been the Soviets' partner in planning the June War but now turned against them. Then, on 21 October, the Soviet ambassador told Nasser that General Sergei Sokolov, the first deputy defense minister, was on his way to sign the agreement. As they spoke, Nasser received the report that Styx missiles fired out of Port Said had just made naval history with the first sinking by missile of a warship Israel's only functioning destroyer, the Eilat. That is the second turning point that the Egyptians list in their narrative, and it's another 50th anniversary that merits revisiting this year. As usual, Nasser decorated Egyptian officers for this exploit, and no credit was given to the Soviets. But 2 days after the incident, it was reported that Zakharov too had returned to Egypt. In Washington, the Johnson administration, already bedeviled by Vietnam, did all it could to avoid any response, as its successor, the Nixon administration, in the person of Henry Kissinger, would also do in the interests of his pet project, détente. There and elsewhere, Zakharov's return was interpreted as a damage control mission to restrain the Egyptians after they acted supposedly against Moscow's wishes. But it soon transpired that Zakharov actually arrived before the incident, and the Egyptians would hardly have defied the Soviets when two of their top commanders were on hand and a crucial agreement was to be signed. Lashchenko had not awaited the formalities, and advisors were already posted on board Egyptian warships. The number of Soviet veterans who have taken credit for the Eilat sinking in widely varying variations illustrates the difficulty of evaluating this type of source. But after rigorous application of the tools that we developed, we can state confidently that the Soviets, as one of them put it, did all but press the launch button, and possibly that too. The advisors' agreement was signed, and its implementation was accelerated. By the year's end, their number had reached 2,500, and their influence was soon felt. The newly proactive spirit that the Soviet Mustasharun inculcated was demonstrated on December 1st, in the third turning point that you may wish to mark in your diary. An Israeli Votur aircraft was shot down over the northern tip of the Gulf of Suez, the first plane that Israel lost since the Six-Day War. It was reconnoitering a missile base under construction, undoubtedly under Soviet supervision, and it took a while for the Israelis to recognize that the SAMs, not anti-aircraft cannon, had begun to make their mark. The two Israeli airmen were never found. Their helmets did wash up on the Israeli-held shore of the Gulf, with the clasps open. That is, someone took them off. It was the first of several such disappearances that we describe in our book, and occurred in the Soviets' proximity, and we believe these cases demand stronger inquiry towards the Russian from Israeli authorities about the fate of still missing servicemen. From this shoot-down, it was a linear progression to the Soviet-backed effort to construct a missile belt west of the canal and to advance it gradually to the canal bank, an essential precondition for carrying out Lashchenko's offensive plan, which he completed by the end of '67. We chose this preliminary transition in the summer of '67 for today's talk because its 50th anniversaries are providing news pegs this summer. Let me, in conclusion, just list briefly a few of the prevailing concepts that we challenge in the subsequent climactic phase of the Soviet intervention, which makes up the bulk of the book. Concept number one, the direct Soviet intervention, Operation Kavkaz, was provoked by Israel's deep penetration air raids around Cairo, which began on the 7th of January 1970. A desperate Nasser flew secretly to Moscow on January 22nd and cajoled the reluctant Soviets to undertake the defense of Egypt's skies. This universally accepted version, which puts the blame for escalating the conflict on Israel, is owed entirely to Nasser's propagandist, Mohammad Hassan Haikal. Multiple and verifiable veterans' accounts have refuted it entirely. The decision to send Soviet-manned SAM batteries and fighter squadrons to Egypt was taken in July 1969 at the latest, and its implementation was well underway before the depth bombings ever began. They did go disastrously wrong, those depth bombings, and in retrospect they were a bad error on Israel's part, but they did not precipitate the Soviet intervention, nor did Nasser's secret visit, in an unlikely case that it took place at all. We can't prove absolutely that it did take place, but it probably did not. Concept number two, Israel won the War of Attrition against the combined forces of Egypt and the USSR. This myth was fostered mainly by the Israeli narrative, which has justly taken pride in the dogfight on the 30th of July 1970, when Israeli planes shot down 5 Soviet MiGs. But it's gradually being accepted by Israeli writers too, that the war was actually lost by several measures. The Soviet-manned SAMs were taking such an unsustainable toll on Israeli planes, and especially their irreplaceable crews, that it forced Israel to accept a ceasefire offer on the 7th of August 1970. That's another date worth commemorating with our new evidence. It prevented Israel from responding when the Soviets and the Egyptians violated the truce immediately by advancing the missile shield to the canal bank with disastrous results on Yom Kippur. Concept number 3 is worth a story on 18th of July, the 45th anniversary of what every history book calls Sadat's expulsion of all the Soviet advisors because Moscow denied him the offensive weapons that he needed in order to attack Israel. For this whopper, we are indebted mainly to Henry Kissinger, who coined the term expulsion, negotiated for months, and took credit for it as a major prize of détente. But the Egyptians and Soviets mounted an elaborate deception exercise that convinced the world and lulled Israel into complacency, leading to the notorious concept, capital C, whereby without Soviet support, Egypt couldn't possibly go to war. In reality, there was no unilateral expulsion. The thousands of Soviets who did leave Egypt were the regulars whose mission was accomplished by the ceasefire. The genuine advisors stayed on to continue induction of new weapons and preparation for the canal crossing, as witnessed the evacuation of the advisors' dependents in October 1973. We promised another word about Israel's nuclear program. If the Soviet and Egyptians tried so hard to stop it in 1967 and failed, what did they do about it afterwards? As we found, they did very little. And since Israel's attaining nuclear weapons was widely recognized in the world by 1973, why didn't it deter the Egyptians and Soviets from launching the Yom Kippur War? A chapter in our books describes how the nuclear issue became a non-issue after 1967. Even the golden opportunity of Israel's absence from the signing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty 40 years ago this Friday, which occurred when Nasser was in Moscow, 49 years ago, sorry, this Friday, which occurred while Nasser was in Moscow, was not exploited for a propaganda blast against Israel. There's not the slightest trace of this consideration affecting the Soviet-Egyptian war plans. But in the event, the war did come close to a nuclear clash. We have a theory to explain all this, but unless you want another lecture, we'll have to refer you to the book.
Thank you very much.
One more, the concept number 4. The Arab attack on Yom Kippur was against Soviet advice. All our evidence shows the opposite. Not only did Egypt receive all the weapons it desired, the Egyptian-Syrian offensive was backed by and coordinated with Moscow. Soviet forces, as well as advisors, even took direct part across the canal. So Egypt's rift with the USSR that did not occur in 1972, did begin after the October War, when a final conventional concept is born out. Once Sadat had scored his redeeming military achievement, he needed the United States for the peace as much as he needed the Soviet Union for the 6-year war. And that actually could have been the subtitle of our book.
Thank you very much.
Now, back to you.
2 compelling presentations. Let's open up for questions. Comments? Please.
Isabella, there are a number of theories of why the Soviet Union was so interested, especially in May of '67, to create the story about the 12 Israeli brigades about to attack the Syrians. I wondered whether you have any specific conclusions about it, what exactly they were looking for.
It is interesting, and
Do your homework.
it is included in this book because the story about Israeli troop concentrations on the Syrian border apparently was a great code between Soviets and Egyptian and probably Syrians, because Brezhnev, when he spoke on June 20th, 1967, to the Central Committee, he said that they warned our allies, Arab allies, of Israelis' aggressive intent, and asked them to take necessary measures. And if you don't count their throwing out of Sinai the United Nations force and moving the Egyptian army into the Sinai, and then closing the Tiran Strait, necessary measures. I don't have any other explanation.
No, but what was important here, as we found here in the first book, the joint Soviet-Egyptian plan to initiate, to provoke the Israelis into a first strike in May-June '67 was very strictly compartmentalized. Very few in either the Egyptian or even the Soviet leadership were aware of it. Some story had to be produced, both to explain what they were doing to the general Arab public and for propaganda purposes outside. So accusations that Israel was concentrating troops on the Syrian border had begun long before. And when it was transmitted again by 3 separate channels on May 13th, the idea was, A, to whip up the popular sentiment in the Arab forces. So Nasser went through the gesture of sending the chief of staff, Fauzi, to Syria, and Fauzi went to the Golan Heights, and of course you could see from the Golan Heights that there weren't any Israeli troop concentrations, much less 11 brigades, which Israel didn't even have at the time. And he reported back the Soviets must be having hallucinations, but the plan went ahead anyhow. So it was a propaganda move, and it was an agreed signal, and it was used for domestic purposes in both Egypt and the Soviet Union, but the top leadership on both sides knew that it was false.
So,
what did the Soviet Union expect from the Egyptian attack on Israel in 1973? What would it gain? And did they have any plans in case the attack succeeds? What? Israel will disappear or be destroyed? Or
No.
What do they have in mind? My other question is, what do you do about...
Can I answer this one first?
Okay.
We mentioned just now that we have in theory why Israel's nuclear deterrence did not deter the Yom Kippur War. And apparently the reason for that is that the Soviets and the Egyptians, and this was Israel's really major achievement in the Six-Day War, moved, at least tacitly, from recognition of Israel only in the partition borders to recognition of Israel in the 1967 borders. And the Soviets, and actually the Egyptians also, limited their aspirations in the military achievement that they thought was absolutely necessary to regaining Sinai. In fact, only to regaining part of Sinai by military means enforcing a political settlement that would regain all of it. The Soviets needed it for a number of purposes. Besides the global impact that it would make, that they had actually assisted, supported their allies in repelling aggression and so on. First of all, it would regain their credibility among their Arab allies, which had been badly hurt in the Six-Day War. There were demonstrations against the Soviets in Egypt and elsewhere. And 2, it would prove again that the Soviet weapons, and in many cases they actually were superior to the Western ones at that time, and they simply had not been operated properly. There were constant accusations from the Egyptians, it's your fault, the Soviets, A, for not coming to our aid during the war, and B, your weapons were inferior and unsuitable for desert conditions. And the Soviets were very, very intent on proving that that was not the case. But the fact is, actually, the Soviet Union was always punching above its weight in the global confrontation with the United States. And they recognized already in the interwar period that breaking off relations with Israel had been a bad mistake. But they could not bring themselves, in several attempts that they made, to somehow restore it. And so the Egyptians, their plan stopped more or less at what would happen after the war, and they went as far as the Geneva Conference and the restoration of Sinai, but when Saddam decided to go for peace, they weren't in a position to provide. Second question.
Is there anything like an SR archive or any open government documentation in Egypt, which you know about?
Absolutely.
Because you keep quoting Nasser's intentions.
Yeah, well-
How do you know?
Well, we,
First of all, there is some documentation from Soviet archives that have been published. It is very few in comparison to Israeli documentation or Western documentation. But at least the important thing that the Russians already in Yeltsin time thought it was important to publish, it was published. Like talks of Soviet ambassador with Nasser before, during, and after the war, and actually the publication stopped at receiving or the UN 242 decision in Russian international affairs as valid.
there's also there's some limited Egyptian Arab documentation that have been published in some memoirs of the Egyptian participants, particularly those who were disgraced and sometimes jailed after the '67 war. And there's a
Some
very,
diplomatic memoirs,
Yeah.
memoirs of the Soviet diplomats like Semyonov or like Akopov and so on, which some of them you probably had seen already in 50 Years War, part 3, as in movie in by BBC.
and finally, there's a very interesting body of evidence of Egyptian documents that were captured by Israel,
Yes.
so-called Africa, after the Yom Kippur War, and they're accessible, but they're not indexed, they're not searchable, you just have to leaf through the volumes. And there's quite a good deal there about the presence of the Soviet advisors and what they were to do and so on, and instructions from the high command in Cairo, how to treat them and what they were there for, etc., etc. So that's about all we have from the Egyptian side, or all anyone has from the Egyptian side.
Also, there's this second book, we had the same fight we had for the first book from the publishing house. They demanded us to cut the sources because I think the third of the book is the sources. So you can check every
What is based on?
what is based on.
Okay.
Yes, please.
To what extent did the Israeli leadership at the time understand the depth of Soviet involvement on the Egyptian side? And if they had a maybe greater appreciation of it, would it have deterred or demoralized them?
Well, the Israeli leadership,
You're speaking about since the war?
War
or Yom
after.
Kippur?
after, at the peak of the Soviet involvement, the War of Attrition, okay, the peak in terms of the scope of Soviet involvement, the Israelis, it took them a while to find out. I mean, the Soviet intervention actually began in the summer, autumn of '69. There were some warnings from Israeli field intelligence which were slapped down by the higher levels in the intelligence branch of the General Staff. And the awareness became clear only when the Soviet pilots were actually spotted there, and when the Soviet missiles, when the SAM-3 missiles were first encountered. And this was about February 1970, which helped to confirm Heikel's version that the whole thing only started January 22nd after Nasser's supposed secret visit. But the Israeli cabinet was very well aware of it, and they tried to convince the Americans, look, the Soviets have made this major advance into the Middle East, and you should do something about it. And the US administration was very reluctant to do anything. Kissinger had been blindsided completely by the Soviet intervention. He thought he had convinced through his new back channel with Anatoly Dobrynin, convinced the Soviets, to go along towards détente, and they did this behind his back, and he was furious about it. That's what started his whole emphasis on expelling the Soviets from Egypt. But they tried at this stage to convince the Israelis that as long as the Soviet presence in Egypt is not advertised, you're not challenging their prestige. And so this will not lead to a major clash. And the Israelis tried against American advice. On 29th of April, 1970, they published a cabinet declaration, which is a very unusual thing, saying, Gewalt, the Soviet air squadrons and SAMs in Egypt, and engaging Israel directly. And they got slapped down so hard by the Americans that they never tried it again. And even when they knew that, say, Israeli Phantoms were being shot down by the Soviet SAMs west of the canal, they referred only to Egyptian missiles. And even when the great triumph of 30th of July, when Israeli planes shot down Soviet MiGs, the Israeli communique spoke only of shooting down Egyptian MiGs, and it took a few weeks for the foreign press to discover that these were actually Soviet piloted craft. So the Israelis were quite well aware, a bit late, but they became very well aware of the Soviet presence. They also had a special Russian speaking eavesdropping or surveillance unit posted in Sinai, which was not only monitoring the Soviets' broadcasts, but also broadcasting to them, both propaganda and sometimes misleading instructions and so on, against the Soviet morale. So Israel was very well aware of it, but in the Israeli press at the time, you find very little reference to a Soviet presence because it was censored out.
Because it would be demoralizing?
No, I think mainly because of U.S. pressure. Mainly. Because up to that really head-on clash that they had with the Americans in April about publicizing the Soviet presence, there were increasing references from Israeli spokesmen and leaders and in the press. Afterwards, it was wiped out completely until after the Yom Kippur War.
Well, I also think that some of the reason for that is in already coming out with the beginning of the concept that without the Soviets, Egypt cannot fight and so on, and it was so that maybe that if they will won't disclose the Soviet presence, maybe the Soviets won't take active part, and it could be easier and so on. And of course, then on top of that, you have to add Marwan Ashraf and his
misleading reports
that helped.
We didn't speak about that today, but our book, research definitely led to the conclusion that we support Eli Zihira's version in the controversy about Marwan Ashraf.
That's another.
But that's another lecture.
Okay, Isabella and Gideon, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Thank you guys for coming. See you on the next event.